Have you ever spoken to someone about the exact same thing, but your views were polar opposites? That's kind of how it is in America in reference to Black history. It's kind of like that caption where a number is painted on the ground. You can ask one person, what do you see? And that person will say, I see a 6. You ask the other person, what do you see? That person will say, I see a 9. Even though they both are looking at the exact same thing. Today, we're starting a journey to unlock the truth about Black history because it is not what they've taught us. My name is Kevin. In my videos, we're going to share the Black experience in America by highlighting a few things like slavery, how America benefited from slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Reconstruction removed, and that's just to name a few. At any time anyone asks you or addresses you about Black history, I want you to do 3 things. 1, I want you to ask yourself, who's telling the story? 2, ask yourself, from what vantage point is the story being told? And 3, ask yourself, what is the message the storyteller is trying to send? A good book that I would recommend for your Black history library is called The 1619 Project, A New Beginning by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Most of us think we know how America began, but what if the story started with a ship full of people whose names history erased? Let's talk about the real beginning of how this country was built. Ironically, we can't see the difference when we compare the arrival of the Mayflower to the arrival of the White Lion. It is recorded that the landing of the Mayflower was at Cape Cod in November of 1620. The Mayflower is introduced in our school's curriculum at the 3rd and the 4th grade level. They introduced it with introducing us to the Pilgrims and the celebration of Thanksgiving. Nevertheless, nearly 1 year prior, a Portuguese ship called the White Lion landed in Port Comfort, Virginia in August of 1619 and offloaded 20 and odd slaves. They recorded them as 20 and odd slaves because they saw them as insignificant without names and identities. What they viewed as insignificant was the advent of a gross and inhumane system called chattel slavery. It was that system, through blood, sweat, and tears, that compelled the Americas into becoming a superpower. These 20 and odd resilient people made it through what's called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is one leg of what's called the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade formed a triangular route connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The treacherous journey took approximately 4 to 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Nearly 13 million enslaved Africans made the trip. Nearly 2 million died during the Middle Passage. Why was such a significant event hidden? In the summer of 2023, I had the unique opportunity to go to Virginia. While in Virginia, I sought out the site where the 20 and odd slaves, as they called it, stepped foot on American soil. When I got in the proximity of where that was located, I asked 2 men did they know where that site was at. Neither of them knew that that site was there. One did say, I know absolutely nothing about it. The other said, well, I think if something is there, it's going to be right down there. So I headed in the direction where he pointed. It was less than a half a mile away where I addressed the men regarding that site. When I got in the area where the site was actually located, I saw a sign, a white sign that sat on top of a pole about 3 feet high. I walked over to it, and sure enough, that was the site where the White Lion landed in 1619. A good book that I would recommend in this video is called Before the Mayflower by Lerone Bennett. If I asked you, what's the difference between slavery and chattel slavery? Could you define the difference? Slavery is defined as owning and controlling another person. Chattel slavery sees the enslaved as property. Slavery was a form of indentured servitude. Indentured servants were treated as humans. During chattel slavery, Africans were treated as property. Indentured servants were allowed to be educated. Under chattel slavery, the Americans instituted anti-literacy laws, and slaves were not allowed to be educated. Not only were they not allowed to be educated, but in many cases, they were not allowed to communicate with each other. Indentured servants worked for a set period of time before gaining their freedom. Chattel slavery rarely granted freedom. Indentured servants' children were usually born free. Under chattel slavery, children were born and died enslaved. It is argued that Africans sold other Africans to the white colonists. While that is true, Africans treated their enslaved as indentured, not chattel. It is not known if they had an idea of the evolution of chattel slavery. If they had known, we can only wonder if they would have done such a thing. Chattel slavery was designed to totally erase a person's identity. And chattel slavery is the first system of slavery where race is a primary factor. Before I end this video, a good book to recommend to build your Black History library is Systems That Shaped America by Tracy Bruce. It's interesting how history showcases the Emancipation Proclamation, but I have a question for you. Did the Emancipation Proclamation free all the slaves? Listening to the general story about it, you would think that it did, right? The answer is wrong. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in the Confederate states. It did not free the slaves in the border states, states like Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and West Virginia. Now, the 13th Amendment in December 1985 abolished slavery nationwide. In May of 2024, I went to Mount Rushmore, and I saw Lincoln's face chiseled in stone. It presented a degree of honor. But what if I reminded you why Lincoln really freed the enslaved? Lincoln did not free the slaves as a noble and humane act. Lincoln freed the slaves as a military war strategy. To clarify his position, in a letter he wrote to Horace Greeley, he said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." During a debate with Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln stated he did not believe in political or social equality between white and black people. Hear me and hear me closely. I am not trying to drive a deeper divide between the races. I am only concerned with unlocking the truth about black history. Before we end this video, I recommend you get the book, The Emancipation Proclamation by John Hope Franklin. 40 Acres and a Mule was a promise made to the formerly enslaved after the Civil War. It was the first systemic attempt to provide reparations to the formerly enslaved. 40 Acres and a Mule was used to describe Union General Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15. The field order redistributed 400,000 acres of confiscated land to newly freed slaves in 40-acre plots. This land was worked for over 200 years by the enslaved with no recompense. The plots were auctioned off to the newly freed slaves. In some cases, it was granted to them in order to provide reparations. This order provided land and resources so that newly freed slaves could be economically independent. So we can imagine what this must have meant to them. We can't fathom today working 1 hour for an employer without compensation. Imagine working for over 200 years and finally you're compensated. Unfortunately, 12 years later, Reconstruction was reversed and the land was redistributed back to the Southerners. 40 Acres and a Mule is one of America's many injustices that black Americans refuse to let the country sweep under the rug. Today, arguments are still being made for reparations. Now, some Americans don't see the reversal of the promise as an injustice. To this day, they use it to ridicule the black race. For example, when President Barack Obama was elected to president, Senator Mitch McConnell said, "There's your 40 acres and a mule." Ladies and gentlemen, a good book to add to your Black History library is called 40 Acres and Maybe a Mule by Harriet Robinette.